Welcome to the podcast for the Wizarding School for Composers. My name is Dr. Joseph Soa, and as a composer and educator, I have seen firsthand the transformative power of the right tools and ideas to enhance creative growth. Join us each week as we demystify the craft of composition with accomplished guests and explore new tools to enhance your creativity, productivity, and joy. Whether you're a seasoned composer or just starting out, this is the place for you. My guests today are two outstanding performers, pianist Olga Kirpicheva and composer and violinist Domenic Salerni. Olga and Dominic will be collaborating on February 29th at South Oxford Space in Brooklyn to put on a new concert. This concert will feature new compositions, including the premiere of Dominic's If Sun and Winter, a piece by yours truly, and other works by living composers. In the conversation today, we will learn more about Olga and Dominic's collaboration, their musical journeys, and their passion for performing new music. We'll also discuss some of Dominic's other exciting projects, including the forthcoming album that he has on Azika Records, as well as the premiere of his piano trio, 7 Meditations, in April. Without further ado, let's get started. Olga and Dominic, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's great to have you both.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to start with a basic question. So Dominic, you're an American violinist. Olga, you're a French pianist. How did you meet each other, and how did that lead to you wanting to collaborate?
Yeah, so this is a wonderful meeting of minds, I guess. We have a mutual friend in the composer Paulina Nazajkinskaya, who was a classmate of mine in graduate school at the Yale School of Music. And Paulina and I were at the Del Mar International Composer Symposium, which Dr. Soa knows very well because he was also on faculty there this past summer. And in reconnecting and, catching up with my old friend Paulina, she mentioned very excitedly that her good friend Olga, who's based in Paris but was trained and born in Russia, was interested in doing some chamber music and actually shared the kind of love that I also have for the violin and piano repertoire. And so we sort of, started talking, started bouncing ideas, mostly over email. So it's really nice to see Olga now kind of for the first time. And so, we're going to put this program together and decided, hey, what an opportunity not only to play one of the great violin sonatas by Franck from the French repertoire, but also to kind of feature some of our friends who are alive and kicking today and making some beautiful music. So that's my perspective on it.
Awesome. Olga, I'd love to hear your perspective. How did you meet Dominic, and what was exciting to you about this upcoming collaboration?
So our common friend Paulina told me a lot of Dominic, amazing violinist. So I heard the recordings on YouTube, and I appreciated your art a lot. And so that's why we are both very excited about this concert and to know better each other through the music. So our first concert, so that's kind of a new experience for us, I think.
That's awesome.
And I think that's also because we have both a very big passion. It's chamber music, so it's a new artist, new pieces, and we are excited about it, about discovering this new thing.
That's fantastic. I actually wanted to ask you both about that. So maybe Olga, will start with you, and then Dominic will go to you. What draws you to chamber music, and what's the creative process like in developing programs?
Yeah, for me, it's just, there's one thing going to the practice room, playing some solo work, for piano. You don't have to ever play with any other instrumentalist and spend an entire lifetime, playing Chopin and, Rachmaninoff and Scriabin and all of these wonderful composers who wrote so exquisitely for the piano. But that can be a little lonely. So it's nice to have friends, with which to play. I think, certainly for me, having been in a number of string quartets and now finding my home in the Azika Quartet, it helps me get out of bed in the morning, knowing that it's not just me, up in front of an orchestra or something, which not only is very difficult, but also, a very, very stressful. So it's nice to just have support, and to play some of the greatest repertoire, written. I mean, of course, there's all of that wonderful solo repertoire, but I think historically, the great composers save some of their best work for the string quartet or for these intimate moments that are often shared in the home or in a small room. So, when we get to South Oxford Space, which I think seats maybe 50, I think we're going to have that kind of salon environment, which I think will be perfect for not only the Franck, but also the new works that we're going to be presenting.
That's awesome. What are your thoughts on this, Olga?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think chamber music, it's like a conversation between people. And it's, if you like this person, if you like the music to share the music with person, we feel it from the first note, and we don't need to do a lot of rehearsals. It's natural actually. So that's why we like to meet a new artist, to meet new musicians. It's always very interesting and very curious to discover new person, the music, through the music.
So now I imagine that, obviously you're currently a continent apart from each other. What is the rehearsal process going to look like, and how are you going to prepare for this concert?
That's a great question. Well, this is where our mutual friend, Paulina, is going to be very useful. I have to kind of brag on Olga because I think Olga is going to be playing, is it the Rachmaninoff Second Piano Concerto? Very good. So with Paulina's youth orchestra, actually, in Connecticut, the Greater Southern Connecticut Youth Orchestra. So Paulina's going to be kind of taking care of Olga in New Haven, but then they're going to come down to New York. And so we're going to find a place. I think Paulina has a studio or something that she has access to. So hopefully with a very good piano. I don't know if she's been in touch with you, Olga, but of course, when you're playing with the piano, I get to bring my violin with me anywhere I go, but every pianist, as you know, Joseph, you never really know what you're going to get. So it may be at the situation where the rehearsal pianos are actually better than the piano in the space at South Oxford, but I think they do a good job. Well, I know it'll be tuned, Olga, so don't worry. But yeah, so well, hopefully, it's a busy time for me. It's a busy time for Olga. She's going to be working with the kids, and I think doing some teaching as well. So, we're going to try to fit in as many rehearsals as we can. And I think we even maybe were able to schedule a recording session after the concert. So yeah, we're going to try to see how much we can get done in really a brief period of time. I think Olga's only in the States for maybe a week, 10 days. So we're gonna try to pack it in there and have as much fun as we can.
What kind of things do you find that you're doing to prepare for this, Olga?
I practice in my piano. I listen some recordings with Dominic. Actually, we will play a sonata by César Franck for violin and piano, and it's the most beautiful thing I think in French repertoire for this duo, violin and piano. And so I played it many times, so I'm really excited to play one more time with Dominic, and yeah, I think I'm ready.
That's awesome.
Great.
I have one more related question to this. So if you're an amateur musician, or if you are, a music student, there's this perception, just because this is the way that amateur music making and a lot of student music making works, that, you're going to have to rehearse a really long time in order to put this together. You're putting together an entire recital, but both of you are highly accomplished professional musicians. What is it from that point of view? You both of you been doing this for decades. What does it actually look like? How much time does it take to put together a recital? And why is it that you can do it on these really tight timeframes?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's something that I think I love that part of your mission in this podcast is sort of to demystify some of these processes, right? I mean, honestly, there's not a whole lot of difference between an amateur musician and a professional. It's just the professional does it quicker because they've been doing it for longer, So I imagine even just from meeting Olga here on this podcast for the first time and being able to even interact a little bit with some visuals, I have the sense that we're going to sit down and maybe start with the Franck, and in a few notes we'll know exactly kind of where we are. So often when there's not a whole lot of time, you'll run through a movement. Maybe you'll say 2 or 3 things. If not, sometimes the best rehearsals are where there's no talking. You're just communicating through the music. And if anything really is necessary to be said, that's a G sharp, or, oh, let's take it faster or slower, something like that, you know? So that's the kind of, and what's great is that, and I have to thank Olga for being on this podcast. I know she was being very self-deprecating about her English, but it's wonderful. My French and my Russian is not very good either. So we don't have a lot in the way, communication tools besides music, which I think is wonderful. It means that we'll actually get at the beat of things even quicker.
I think it's really fascinating. Olga, I'd love to hear your perspective too. How is it different now that, you're no longer in school? I mean, you've been out of school for many, many years.
Not too many years. Not too many years, Joseph. Come on, we're young people here.
I think for me, the most important difference is that now I know how many time I need for this or for that piece or for another piece. So I know exactly how many days or when I have to start this program for this concert. So for me, it's just a question about organization. So it's much more easy now. Yeah. And for example, for our first meeting with Dominic, I'm sure that don't need to explain some things. It will be natural. So we will just play and just feel each other. Yeah, it's this way I prefer.
Yeah, no, I think that that's really fascinating. But it makes sense to me. It makes sense to me that you'd get to this point where you could look at a piece of music and you're like, oh yeah, this is about how long it will take to prepare. And these are the things that I need to do for it. I think that that's really cool. A question that I have for both of you, Olga and Neil, you need to take off in a second. Many composers would love to collaborate with artists of your caliber. I know that I'm looking forward to it. What advice would you give to composers who don't have connections with folks like you, but are hoping to make those kinds of connections?
Well, I mean, you flatter in a way. I think any composer, as well, and as I'm discovering, is sort of only as relevant as the people around around them, and I think so much of writing music is about creating community. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there's this maybe false hierarchy of, oh, well, here's the best and here's the on the way to, or something like that. But I think you should look, in your immediate vicinity, whether it's a friend or a member of the family or maybe your church pianist or something like that. Or who are the resources? Where are the resources that you can, find in your community and as kind of easily, as readily as possible? And then what does that music sound like? If you're talking about someone who, let's take, for example, the Jack Quartet. These guys are an amazing group and they play very intense music, very, very specific, highly nuanced, very difficult, music. That's great. And those composers, sometimes they're alive, sometimes, they're in the canon, but, those guys are situated to play that kind of music. But, I can't necessarily, as a composer myself, I can't just call up the Jack Quartet and say, hey, play my piece, But, I have other people that I can play with, other people that, I can, run stuff by. And so, for example, between Olga and me, we're able to play the people that we know. I mean, so, we're playing Caroline Shaw, we're playing Joseph Sola, we're playing Paulina Nazaikinskaya. And, actually, I have to say, this is where it kind of, who you're talking to really is important. Paulina, was planning on writing a piece for this. And I kept asking her about it. How's the piece coming? How's the piece coming? And she said, well, yeah, I'll write a piece, but you have to write a piece too. And so she put my feet to the fire and she forced me to be, to be the aspirational composer that I am. So we both kind of revised some earlier work and are presenting kind of versions of things that have existed before in this concert. Well, and again, sort of to your point, Joseph, you had such a wonderful presentation at the Del Mar International Composer Symposium, and you had showed this piece, Night Flocks of Angel Trumpet, and it was a violin and piano piece. Well, Paulina was just talking to me about her friend Olga, and I happened to play the violin. So it was like, oh, this is great. And, I got to hear, I can't remember if it was a live recording or a studio recording of your piece and with the score going. And I kind of got to know a completely new work from scratch just by virtue of, being in the right room at the right time. So I think, yeah, it's not something, I can't tell you how many kind of cold calls we get as a quartet. And that's one way of going about it. But I think there's an organic way of surrounding yourself by the people that you want to be sharing your music with. That's the long-winded version. Sorry. My coffee clearly it's kicked in now.
Well, I think that you touch on a bunch of really important points. I think that for composers, there is a very strong amount of like grass is greener on the other side syndrome, or like, even imposter syndrome of, no one is going to care about my local connections here in, Pawtucket or wherever random place it is that you live. I need to be going for these, awesome connections. But I think that you make a really great point is like everywhere that you live, unless you're living, I don't know, like literally in the middle of Antarctica by yourself, you always have a community of people, and those communities are going to be making music together.
I want to hear the Joseph Soa symphony for 10 penguins, though, to be premiered in Antarctica. That would be, I would go to Antarctica to see that show for sure.
Well, I would go to Antarctica to see that show too. So, let's check back in a few years when this happens. Olga, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this question. What advice would you give to composers that, are hoping to make connections with excellent musicians?
In France, I played a few times young composers, and even organized one competition for young composer during COVID pandemic. Yeah, it was a very nice experience, and we had 30 candidates, so it was very interesting to choose the pieces. And actually, just one thing, I think you should do to have something to tell, and to tell it to the public, and to find something new, something yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's really great. I think sometimes some composers really want their music to speak for itself. They're like, hands off, I just notes on the page, whatever. But, when you come into it, kind of like what you're saying, Olga, in my experience, and Dominic, I'd be curious to hearing yours as well. When you come into music saying, I have a thing that I'm trying to express in music that I can also express a little bit in words, it helps people connect to the music more.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think people, especially now with so many platforms with technology, whether it's a podcast or, a short reel on Instagram or something, I think this notion of, seeing how the sausage is made is really part of the process. And again, it helps demystify this sort of like, oh, this creative is off in a room being creative, and suddenly they come to the rest of the world and present, the magic stones or whatever. So yeah, I think any chance a composer has to say, here's what I was thinking, or here's a little bit about what this is about, even just as a way in, it may not be the entire dissertation. I think if you're speaking longer than the pieces, maybe there's a problem, but, I think it's really nice to frame something with very little music just sort of exists in a vacuum. You think of the way most people interact with music. It's, while watching a TV show or watching a film, or maybe listening to it in the background while they study or something. There's always, not always, but often something else happening. And it's a huge ask actually of an audience member to not only maybe pay money and sit in a chair for maybe an hour and a half to listen to music designed for a concert hall, and then have all the tools to really appreciate, what's happening without any other context. So yeah, I think anything a composer can do to put it in context is usually really helpful.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, Olga, I know that this is probably about time for you to go. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, we're fine. But as you're about to head out, we're going to continue the conversation with Dominic, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming. It's been a pleasure to have you here. I look forward to meeting you in a few weeks in Brooklyn.
Yeah, thank you so much for this invitation. Bye, see you.
All right. See you later, Olga.
Au revoir. Bonne journée.
So, Dominic, we're now focusing just on you. I'm very excited to see you and Olga in action, but let's talk a little bit more about your work as a violinist, your work as a composer. You wear a ton of hats. Between composing, performing the Azika Quartet, your teaching, I'm kind of curious, which role came first and how do these roles inform each other?
Well, I'd love to. The idealist in me would say that all of these roles are just facets of one sort of creative impulse, which is a little bit, I think, the direction we're going now in music at large. This whole division of composer, performer, teacher, these divisions are starting to break down, which I think is very exciting. But if you're talking specifically about my life in music, I started out really more as a player. I was doing all of the pre-college stuff. I was a Suzuki student. And then at some point, you sort of fall into playing with other people. And so that became kind of like, oh, it's so much more fun to be a chamber musician instead of, trying to go, into this very highly competitive, solo route or whatever. And then, teaching kind of came a little bit later, but I'd say maybe that's the next thing. When I joined my very first quartet down in Atlanta, my second violinist was having her first kid, and she said, "Hey, so do you want to take over my studio?" And I hadn't really, until that point, taught in a really serious way. And so I kind of had this baptism by fire, which was, I learned a lot very quickly, and it was great. And I cherish having had that opportunity, and then composing as like kind of a more serious discipline, is still kind of happening. I feel like we've talked about this, in the past, this notion of process and, how you're the most productive or how you're the most creative. So that's something that's definitely the newest facet for me. But again, all of these things inform each other. You could be stuck in a practice room for years and years and then have like one recital. And I think you learn more in that recital than you do in the practice room. And so, kind of breaking down that barrier. And I think the same thing goes for teaching. If you can't explain something concisely in a way that another person with a completely different set of circumstances can understand, can grasp, and then can apply, if you can't do that, then you wonder, how have you internalized it? So I found that my playing has gotten better through teaching. My ability to communicate as a creative person, has improved through that. And I think that also applies to composing. If you have this really brilliant idea, but through whatever the mitigating circumstances of notation or the, I don't know, whether you're in an electroacoustic environment or something, and well, you really need that max patch, but you don't know max, or, there's all of these things that can hinder that, immediacy of whatever's happening creatively up here and its appreciation sort of out there, So I think all of these things are a bit in conversation, but that's a little bit where I find myself now. And sometimes, you forget where you put your latest hat. Oh crap, I'm composer hat now, or I'm, so there's a little bit of that too.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a lot to juggle. And actually, I want to ask you a question that's potentially a little bit vulnerable, if that's all right.
No, only the most public facing and shiny. No, go ahead. It's all good.
So I think that you're a stand-in for a lot of performers. And I know a lot of really highly trained performers. I have friends in the LA Phil. I have other friends, and who are also very accomplished artists like yourself, who, they would think nothing of, getting on the world's biggest stages and performing just because this is what you do, However, when it comes time to compose, it's like, oh my goodness, the terror, the fear, the horror, like the imposter comes in like full tilt. And I'm curious, like, what was that experience like for you, and what have you been doing to overcome that?
Oh man, that's a great question. And well, so in a way, composition for me in its earliest stages kind of started a little bit as therapy, So like there was a music lab at Emory University that was open pretty late. And so I could just let myself in with the faculty badge and just kind of put myself in a corner. And if I had anything in my head, which it turns out I did, and that's something I think a lot of composers, that the initial hump, like, is anything good? Like, what is this even? And so I worked through a lot of that initial kind of like, is this really something that I do, as a sort of way of escaping life, professionally or otherwise. So that helps. That was a kind of confidence building exercise. I think, yeah, then the next step is like, okay, asking a friend to play your piece, or yourself programming, your own music on a concert. That took a little bit longer. And I think there wasn't really like an aha moment, but I think I applied what I knew from performing to composing. And a lot of it is you just got to start, right? So if you've been performing for, for 30 plus years now, I'm sure there's an analogy. My very first performance ever, I was so excited. I remember I had this blue tuxedo on, and I was so excited that I actually tripped and fell on my violin. I think I was maybe three and a half. So if you think about it, I'm actually trying to come to terms with that 30 years later, So it takes some time, but I sort of feel like that was composing. Like I remember I put together, this was a product of the pandemic, but I had a wonderfully supportive community member in my hometown of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And so I was able to put on a concert of, I think, entirely my own music except for one piece. And I asked my friends from New York to come down and to do it. Of course, I learned a lot. There wasn't enough rehearsal time. I asked some of the performers to do way too much. And, I would say it was successful because, when a composer gets any of their music done, that's the moment, right? Now, was it the best playing? Was it the best conceived situation? No. I mean, I learned a lot, and I would say that I made some mistakes. But that for me, if you're talking about like kind of a bite-sized moment, I learned so much in that from a contracting the players to wait, maybe this is too long, or do people really want to hear it in a program of just my music? Like, that sort of thing. So having those experiences, I think, is so foundational for composers. And again, that could look like, I got lucky. I had a venue. I had someone who was interested in me. There was sort of a lot of buy-in, to this idea. But it can be as simple as, going to your local coffee shop and getting out your guitar and singing your song. I mean, that's a lot of, I'd say those processes are the same. And it's just a matter of how they're taking shape. So I don't know if that's useful, but.
Well, I think that is. I'm going to ask you, I have a couple of follow-up questions on that, but I think my first observation is, and, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe there's a sense that, as professionals, it's like, well, I am a professional musician. I am known as a professional musician. And, there's this expectation if I'm going to be like a professional clarinet player and people expect me to be a professional clarinet player, I need to show up as a composer on the same stages at the same level. But what it's sounding to me is just like, you didn't show up to Carnegie Hall and be like, here's my debut solo recital as a composer. You went to a safer space. You went to a community where you could show up in that space. It's a smaller stage, but there's no shame in any direction for this being a smaller stage. And that gave you the place to experiment.
Well, and yes, and you're totally right. I also think the another salient point, I don't think you just go, even if tomorrow, if I went to Carnegie, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Well, yes, you practice, but also, there's a whole set of circumstances that have to do with that. I mean, yeah, I can literally take the R train from my apartment to Carnegie Hall if I wanted. But if I literally, right now, tomorrow, showed up at Carnegie and said, hey, I want to do a thing, they'd be like, yeah, well, talk to this guy and it's going to cost you this amount of money. And like, you can make it happen if you want. I'm thinking of, there's a wonderful article actually in the New Yorker about this guy. I think his name is Scott Frank or Frank Scott. I'm getting it wrong, but he's a script doctor. So here's a guy who he's written screenplays, he's written plays, but his job for the past, 20 plus years has been, hey, we really need that final edit on insert famous movie, Minority Report, one of the Hunger Games, that kind of thing. And here's a guy who's made, I'd say, a very successful living doing that. And he's still like, well, I really want to write a Broadway musical, so he has sort of similar aspirations. Of course, he can't just go up to Broadway, knock on the door and say, put on my musical. But because he's the kind of guy who's done very well in one field, he can use the resources that he's gained, to try something out off Broadway. And that's exactly what he's doing. I mean, that's sort of on the largest scale, the same idea. He's going to his version of the local coffee shop and saying, hey, can I try out some of my songs? He's just got the resources to like book a theater and get people to do his musical, and then learn along the way.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's a really great analogy. Let's make it most pointed now. Because I know a lot of people in my audience fall into this category. If you were talking to that, like imagine in your mind one of your performer friends that is a little bit composer curious, like they think they want to try this out. What advice would you give to a performer in that situation?
So in like in the most general way, or like they want their piece. What's the situation? Do they want their piece to be played? Do they want to like what's their desire?
Well, their desire is, I mean, obviously this is a fictitious person, but their desire is, I'm curious about composing. That seems like it would be a fun thing to do, but I'm nervous about doing this because I'm a performer and I'm afraid of doing this badly. What advice would you give them?
Well, do it. Just do it. But actually, I know that they're okay. It's a little bit. Actually, it's funny. This is a great question, and I went through this too. I think you have to be okay calling yourself the thing that you are, right? So like, it was a long time for me to feel comfortable calling myself a composer, right? And that's a whole conversation in and of itself. But if you are a composer, then you are ostensibly what you do. So if you haven't done it yet, you can't call yourself that, right?
Mhm.
I mean, if you sing in the shower, I guess you've written something, so you can totally call yourself a composer. I mean, there's there's a certain value in being honest with yourself about the vision that you have for yourself. If all you want to do is sing in the shower, great, you're the best composer that ever lived. You
Mhm.
know, if you want to get programmed at Carnegie Hall, you got to do some other things. You might have to write a big orchestra piece, or you might have to know some people who can make a phone call, or So yeah, I think it depends on the vision and what you're going for. For the performer who wants to kind of do composing, first you have to carve out time.
Mm.
If people think that composing is like the writing of the notes, that's usually like the last thing, right? I mean, you're sitting there thinking about, man, what about that transition? Or like, how long is this? What is this piece? There's so much kind of like up here that can, the nice thing is that you don't need a practice room to be a composer. You don't need that physical, externalization necessarily until the very end when you need to make some sort of notation so that another person can play it. I think this is, I'd say, especially it depends on the kind of performer we're talking about, but like jazz musicians do this all the time. You know, I have to do 2 choruses tonight in a tune I just learned. Okay. That's a very quick internalization process, right? If it's a standard and it's something that they've played a bunch, yeah, then the solo might come, super quick, and they know they have all of this like accrued 100+ years of history to draw on. If it's a new tune that their buddy just wrote and they only have one rehearsal, and then they got to fly for 3 choruses while they're getting comped on all these substitution chords. Yeah, you got to do that. So I'd say if the performer is a jazz musician, like they're already doing that. And if the performer sort of hasn't tapped into, improvisation as a tool, I'd say that's another way in.
So what I'm hearing is improvisation. I'm hearing just do it. And I'm hearing it's okay to call yourself a composer. As long as you are doing something that looks like composition, it's composing.
100%.
Awesome. Well, let's talk about your composing. I'd love to hear the story behind If Sun in Winter, which is premiering the recital. What was your inspiration and how did that title emerge?
Cool. So this is a funny one. And again, I have to shout out Paulina for kind of pushing me into this. So I wrote, actually, this goes back to my grad school days. So I, in fact, took composition at one point with the esteemed Jordan Cuspa, who is another mutual friend of Joseph's and mine. He's also the artistic director of the Del Mar International Composer Symposium. And Jordan said, "Hey, do you want to take composition lessons?" And I said, "Oh my God, yeah, totally. He's a buddy of mine. We're going to hang out. It's going to be great." And we did all of those things. And, occasionally we'd talk about music. And I had opened up this collection of Billy Collins, and I just randomly to a random page, and it was this questions about angels. And I just took one of the stanzas from that, and that was my assignment. Okay. Jordan said, "Write a song." I said, "Okay, great." We'd been listening to like Tori Amos and like a bunch of other people. And I sat down and I wrote this song. And we talked about it. And, actually at one point, I gave a copy to Billy Collins, and he said, "Oh, I'm going to check this out on my piano." So that was a really fun process that took many, many years. Anyway, fast forward like 10 years. And here I am in New York, and I went back to the song and I went, "Oh, I forgot I did this." And then I realized, oh, that piano part's a little skimpy. So I started revising, and I realized this was such a fun process. And I went to, my library, and I picked out some of the poems that or the poets, actually. I didn't even know what the poems were going to be. And I just started setting things. And so this happened pretty quickly. And I compiled a very short song cycle, about 5 minutes worth of of music. And so one of the songs was actually a setting of my own words called Snapshot. And it was sort of like, it was a snapshot, a portrait of, where I live in Brooklyn, and the feeling of when you have like your winter coat on and you get sweaty, on your wrists if it's kind of holding too much. And then, the feeling is of having coffee in the morning and walking in the brisk air and stuff. So that was the song. And literally, we're talking about a minute's worth of 1 minute of music. So again, I'm going to be talking longer than the pieces. But when Paulina said, hey, you should write something for this recital, I went, oh gosh, and I just come off some other projects. I wasn't feeling terribly inspired. So it was really exciting for me to have a project. And I thought, well, and I just played a lot of Brahms, and Brahms in his violin sonatas, he's, taking from his earlier songs. And I was just, just finished a book on Mahler. Oh, you look at his symphonies, it's all these earlier songs. So I was like, okay, I'm going to pull from these guys and do that. So I took the Snapshot, which was, I thought, in a way, maybe the most personal or original statement. And I said, will this work as music outside, away from the word? I think it does. But I realized, I needed to have some syntax going on because there's no words. So, this was a fun project for me to kind of take these notes in this context and recontextualize them. And hopefully they make, sense as a violin piano piece.
Yeah. Well, I'm very excited to hear it and see what it sounds like. But you've had multiple of these compositional irons in the fire. You also have an album of arrangements coming out on Azika Records in April. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. I'm very, very excited about this project. And again, for your sort of performer who wants to be a composer, another way in is arranging. I love arranging because sort of the original material is spoken for, right? You're dealing with someone else's work, and then you're sort of translating it, right? So I think that's great because then you really get to focus on the decisions of translation. So, in this case, the project title is Change is Going to Come. And it's all protest songs from the 60s from the Sam Cooke Change is Going to Come, the eponymous song, to works by Phil Ochs, Pete Seeger, Judy Collins, Abel Meeropol. So we got a lot of people who are saying somewhat different things in a moment that, I think resonates particularly today. Post 2020, a lot of people are asking a lot of questions about what is an equitable society? Are we there? What more needs to be done? So I think this is a really timely album, but from a purely selfish standpoint, it was really great to interact with some of this work and recontextualize. Sometimes it's just the voice, and then you have to like translate it to, in this case, a string orchestra. So we have the Palaver strings. They're sort of the vehicle behind this record. We have Nicholas Pan, wonderful tenor, Farai Malik, who's a jazz stylist and wonderful. Gosh, I don't even know. She's a soprano and alto. She's kind of everything. She's got an incredible range. So taking what was just maybe the voice or a voice and guitar and, recontextualizing it in an ensemble that can read as specifically classical. A lot of this music is folk, or is coming from a pop, kind of angle. So I'm thinking like Bob Dylan, for example, Blowing in the Wind. This is just a man talking about inequity with a guitar and occasionally a harmonica. So how do you translate that to, a bunch of classically trained violinists, violists, cellists, and bassists? So that was really fun for me. I feel like I went a little tangential, but yeah, going back to the composing aspect, I found that the choices I was making, the decisions I was able to make, because I wasn't responsible for the original material, I was able to focus in a way that was really fun. And I learned a lot. The other thing too about composing, there's this feedback loop of like hearing it for the first time. And so because I was also helping to produce the record with Alan Bice, who's an incredible recording engineer, I was able to hear these things happen, not only in rehearsal, but in the recording space. So if something needed to be changed or that really didn't work, I could say, hey guys, can you try this? Or actually that chord needs to be that, or basses and cellos put that together. So you're making decisions on the fly. Whereas if you just sort of submitted the material and called it a day, you wouldn't have had that feedback loop. So I was able to do that. And again, I learned a lot about what works, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I'll ask two follow-up questions What did you most enjoy about this project? And what was one thing that you learned that you're going to apply to your future compositions?
Oh man. Well, I enjoyed seeing everyone kind of start to understand this music. I think for some of the players, these are it's a pretty young band. So a lot of these people are coming out of, grad school and stuff, and they just have so many, they have so much chops. They can play anything, right? And so to throw at them, some Bob Dylan or some Sam Cooke, we're talking about different styles, we're talking about different techniques. So seeing what I had written on the page be translated into, oh, that's a folk idiom, or that needs to have a little jazz kind of, a little swoop in there or something. So seeing that happen in real time was really, really fun for me. And then I realized, oh, I need to notate that differently. Or, sometimes you actually just write stuff or description in the score, sound like a harmonica. Oh, okay, duh. And then suddenly it's like immediately there. So that was kind of cool. I guess that's sort of things like that, so the fun of the playing around with your decisions, seeing if they worked. And I'm a pretty open, I guess, composer creative. I don't know how some people, they're like, here it is, and that's it. And that's the word of God and the Bible, and don't change it. And, for me, the other part of the learning and the fun was if someone had an idea, hey, what if you, like, actually, for example, this is a good one in, What Are We Fighting For, which is the Phil Ox tune. I was kind of trying to do this hip hop thing where there's the bass and then we had this backbeat. And so kind of in group composition, this notion of, okay, what if we take, I was calling them chops, right? That's the backbeat. What if we turn those? And I'd already sort of initially thought of the idea, oh, we're going to do ricochet on one of the verses. And then they're like, yeah, but what if we take this out? And what if we spread out the ricochets? And what if the tempo goes away for a bit? So that happened. And it was like this totally dramatic moment and something I hadn't originally thought of. So it was really cool to invite people into the process. And then, something I wouldn't have thought of myself made it better. So it was really cool to have kind of a few more than just one cook in the kitchen.
That's awesome. Yeah, I know from myself as a composer too. I mean, like, from the outside, people look at me and like, I'm much more of a straight up composer. I mean, I don't have any sort of like performing thing on my plate, but I'm right there with you. Like, the collaborative aspect of composition can be really fun when you find performers that are really willing to share ideas and try things out with you. Going back to that second question, what's one thing that you learned from this process?
Well, honestly, that feedback loop that I was talking about isn't always afforded. And so I'm not the only arranger on this album, and the other two guys who did great work, didn't get the privilege that I had of hearing it happen in real time and then making adjustments if that was needed. So without being, too explicit, there are some things that we changed a little bit about some of these other guys' arrangements because they just worked better in the moment. Again, if they were in the room, I think they would have made similar decisions. And we're talking very subtle things. I don't think with apologies and also permission, I think they would agree. And that's another thing too. If someone is really, I guess, proprietary or sensitive about their own material, you don't want to be going in there and messing with it. The thing about arranging is it's not your material to begin with. So I feel like there's a little more freedom in that. So anyway, so that was something I learned. But yeah, and for me, it's also finding the people where you can sort of have that playground. And I think that, moving forward, I would be searching more and more for that kind of collaborative spirit. And I think so much good is born of that, this kind of notion of, again, the separation of the performer, the composer, the this, the that, the librettist. If we break some of those barriers down, I think there's just a much more interesting final product, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I totally agree with you. That lines up perfectly with my experience. We're about out of time at this point. If people want to continue to find out about you, if they want to get a hold of you, where can people reach you?
Yeah. I mean, you can find me where you find a lot of stuff online. I have a YouTube channel if you want to subscribe. My website is my first name, last name at, .com. So DominicSalerni.com. You can find me playing with the Azika Quartet. That's sort of, I think, a lot of the first point of entry for folks. I think I'm on Bandcamp and SoundCloud and sort of all the places that you might expect someone who's, making their own stuff to put some of it out there. So, yeah, I mean, I think if you just do a Google search, you should be able to find me.
Awesome. Well, do you have any final thoughts you want to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I said Judy Collins and I meant Joni Mitchell. So clearly I haven't had enough coffee this morning. But I don't think Judy Collins is known as a terribly protest forward kind of person or artist. But yeah, no, like Joni Mitchell. Oh my God. What an incredible voice. And I mean that in the largest possible way. But yeah, I'm thinking particularly of this piece, the fiddle and the drum. And that was maybe the hardest thing, to go back to your question. That was maybe the hardest thing to arrange for me, because it's just her. She says one thing in one key, she makes a modulation, she says similar stuff, and then there's a huge payoff at the end. It's like, well, that's so minimal. What am I going to do to there's no way to make that better. How do I translate that to 13 players and a singer? So, to realizing that less is more sometimes. Yeah, it reminds me. So Andrew Yee, the cellist in my quartet, often does collaborative work with Caroline Shaw. And Caroline, of course, is sort of known for her sparse textures and, the clarity. She likes triads. I mean, she's using very traditional means and saying something really oftentimes very radical. But she does it with such an economy of means. It's almost, it's really impressive. And so, Andrew will come to her with some chords or with some textures or some ideas. And when Caroline says, yeah, we really got to take things away, like it's a little too much going on, I think that's really funny, because, she's so minimal. So I sort of took that to heart in what I was going for in some of these arrangements, because it's like, wow, you really start to realize, what works and what little change can really make a huge difference. So anyway.
I think that's a great lesson.
Yeah. When Caroline Shaw says it's too much,
but this is the advice. Go see what Caroline says.
Yeah. Yes. And that's great advice, actually, for all aspiring performers and composers. Check her out. She's doing great work.
Cool. Well, Dominic, it's been a pleasure to have you here today. I know that our listeners will be very inspired by hearing the stories that you and Olga shared. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, you're here, and then we'll thank Olga as well for joining me on the Wizarding School podcast.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Joseph, for all of it. I can't wait to play your piece, and I'm looking forward to the whole project. I think it's going to be really fun.
All right. Thanks. I will see you then.
All right. Cool, man.